Hello ladies and gentlemen, good to see you again. Today we're going to be working on the 10th laboratory for what is almost one of the last for GGS 300 in fact, and we're going to be kind of cementing some of those concepts that we went over within the lecture 13 and also some of the previous lectures, so lecture 11 as well. Okay, so we're going to start by working on correlation today. So I hope by now it's easy for you to just download the code that you need for this off the Blackboard website, and that you're able to just open it up within RStudio and basically follow along in tandem with this video so that you can start to understand exactly how we kind of tap out manually some of those calculations that we've been over in those previous lectures, and then also use some of the inbuilt tests for efficiency later on. So if you need to use these after this course and you know how to use the quicker inbuilt functions, and you know what's actually being carried out behind the scenes. But I think, you know, the fact that you're getting to a point where you can just open up RStudio and start to hack your way through this, that's a really strong skill. So I think you should be really enthused about what you've learned in this class. You know, it's more than just learning some stats. Actually, you've started to pick up the basics of programming, using RStudio, using the command line, and that's incredibly powerful both for, you know, your future progress, but also for your career prospects. Okay, great. So let's push on here. So we're going to use some data from the Lattice package. So let's have a look at that. So this is actually just a graphics package. I've used it maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. Actually, I've been using ggplot2 pretty much ubiquitously for the last 5 or 6 years. So this is pretty standard. I think this is a good package. Traditionally, I just moved away from it a few years ago. But today we're not really using it explicitly. We're just using some of the inbuilt data sets essentially. So so that's fine for what we need it for here. So let's click on environmental here. So this is just an inbuilt data set which comes with Lattice, and basically it's got a bunch of environmental metrics with it. So let's have a look here at the data frame. Okay, so 4 variables. We've got ozone, radiation, temperature, and wind. So this is the atmospheric environmental conditions in New York City, okay? And that's the daily measurements of ozone concentration, wind speed, temperature, and solar radiation in New York City for May to September 1973. So have a look at the data if you're interested, if you want to understand it. What I think is important here is that we get the units, because obviously that's fundamental for what we're doing, garbage in, garbage out. So the ozone metric is the average ozone concentration of hourly measurements in parts per billion. And the other one that we're going to be looking at here is temperature. So that's temperature in degrees Fahrenheit daily. Okay. So we're not going to bother with radiation and wind today, and let's just take those metrics that we're interested in and place them into the global environment. So we've got a couple of vectors here that then we're able to start doing the correlation plots with. Okay, so I've just opened up these slides for the lecture that hopefully you've already watched. And the important part is that we're going to be going over how you calculate the covariance manually, Pearson's correlation coefficient. Then we're going to be looking at Spearman's rank, and then we'll get on to a variety of other tests from the previous lecture. So let's have a look first at these 2 variables when we plot them. So if we do a plot of temperature versus ozone, so we've got temperature on the x-axis here, and we've got the ozone level on the y-axis. There's a slight positive correlation there. So as you start to increase the temperature, it looks as if the ozone parts per billion also starts to increase. Okay. So let's have a look if we can quantify that correlation. So let's do that by hand. And first off, we're going to need to get the covariance, as I mentioned before. So to get the CV of x and y here, we need to basically sum up the deviations of x from its mean and the deviations of y from its mean, okay? So we need to first get the means for the two different variables here. So I'm going to enter those into the global environment. So we've got x bar for the mean of temperature and y bar for the mean of ozone. So that's this character here and this character here within the slides. Then we need to get the standard deviation for each of these metrics. So that's SD of x and SD of y, which I can add into the global environment. And then we need to get n, so that the actual length of all of the data points. So the number of data points which we have, which is 111 within our data set. So now let's get the covariance between the two metrics. So basically it's this calculation here. So we are subtracting the mean for temperature from every single one of the data entry points within the temperature vector. And we're subtracting the y bar, which is the mean ozone, from every one of the ozone points. And that produces basically a set of deviations. So I've just printed it here to the console to give you an indication of what that looks like. So you get some which are above the mean, which are obviously positive, and some which are below the mean, which are negative. Okay, and then what we can do is we can sum these up, which gives us the covariance value that we're interested in. So that's 24,367.28 is the covariance value, and I can put that into the global environment up here. So that gives us the first part of the calculation, which is basically based on this covariance structure. Now you'll remember when we were actually going over in the slides the correlation coefficient, that essentially we needed to get this R value here. And the reason why we calculated that covariance in the previous step was because the numerator here requires it, because we need to get CV divided by n, so the number of paired data values. So we know already that the covariance is this 24,367 figure, and that the n is 111, so the number of data points that we have in the data set. So that's essentially what we're going to be calculating here in the numerator. And then for the denominator, we basically need to get the standard deviation of the x and the y value, and they need to be multiplied together. So that's this denominator over here. And when we do that, we get a fairly sensible positive correlation coefficient here, which is 0.69. And I think that's kind of what we were expecting, something within that realm when we were looking at the data and saying that this is basically a reasonably strong positive correlation here. So I think that's quite straightforward, hopefully. So we're able to calculate this R value. I mentioned before there's multiple ways to actually calculate it, but this is the easiest way for us to do it, and that's the way that we've decided to do it in the practical today. And then we could actually test this value. So once we've got the correlation coefficient, we can try to get the t-statistic, and the point of this is that it allows us to determine if an association actually exists between these two variables, providing we can meet all the different assumptions. So the R value here, we're able to plug into the calculation that we have to get the t-statistic. So you'll remember this from the slides. We need to get R multiplied by the square root of n minus 2 to get the numerator, and then we need to get the denominator, which is the square root of 1 minus r squared. So we can do that up here. Essentially we've got the r multiplied by the square root of n minus 2 here, and then we've got the denominator as well. So when we do that, we're able to get this t value, which is 10.01. And as normal, once we get a test statistic, we're able to plug that into the inbuilt function R, which is able to look at the probability of that value occurring against the t distribution in this case. So when we do that, we actually get a very small number. So it's far below the 0.05 significance level, which we generally look for, for us to be 95% certain that the conclusion that we reach hasn't just occurred at random, by chance. So it's really quite a small p-value that's suggesting that there is a strong correlation between these two metrics. So that's one way that you can get the p-value. We calculated it manually there, but you could just use the inbuilt correlation function. So if I just type this in here, we go help COR for core, and that will bring up the correlation variance and covariance matrices. And in here, it gives you a description of all the different functions that you've got for variation, for covariation, for correlation, etc., etc. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but the point is that it's inbuilt within R, and you're able just to run it if you want. And if you did, you basically just get exactly the number that we calculated by hand, pretty much, but it calculates it within just one line of code, two individual inputs, the temperature and the ozone, so the two metrics that you're interested in correlating. So I think that should be fairly straightforward to you. Okay, so that was all kind of assuming that we met the assumptions of using the parametric data test. Sometimes you might not be able to meet those assumptions, so you might, as a consequence, have to downgrade your data into using a non-parametric test. So within the lecture, we covered Spearman's rank correlation coefficient, and what we were interested in doing there was trying to look at the correlation when we've got non-normally distributed data, for example, or there's types of data that don't meet the assumptions. So you'll notice here when we're using correlation, we're actually downgrading that continuous data into a ranking, basically. So if I just type this, it's just ranking from 1 all the way up to 111, all of the different data entry points. And then when we run the COR, the core function, this is basically saying method equals Spearman's rank, so it knows that we're running this non-parametric test. And we do get a slightly different estimate for the correlation. Obviously, we're using ordinal data here, not continuous, but it's still, again, this time it's a stronger positive correlation, but they're ballpark roughly the same. Okay, and you can also calculate rho to see whether or not there is a correlation between x and y for Pearson's product moment correlation coefficient. So you can get the rho value, and you can test whether or not there is a correlation between the two. Okay, so we're able to do that. So for Spearman's rank for the non-parametric data. And actually, when we do that, we're getting really quite a small p-value. So down here, so it's actually saying that there is, a significant effect. There is a significant correlation between these two metrics that we've decided to correlate in this way using a non-parametric test. Okay, so hopefully that's reasonably clear to you now, and you'll be able to play with some of the code which I've provided you to understand how to think about these tests, to carry out the p-value analysis in order for you to kind of evaluate different hypotheses that you might want to use these tests to assess. So that's correlation. Now I just want to back up a little bit and get back to some of the categorical tests which we carried out within previous lectures. So you will remember that we covered the Kolmogorov-Smirnov goodness of fit test. So essentially within this, what we're trying to do is to assess whether there's a normal distribution. Okay. So I'm not going to go through all of these slides again because you've seen it already, but what we're interested in doing is comparing the distribution of the data variable that we've got against a random distribution that we would expect to occur by chance. And if there's a significant effect here, what it's indicating to us is that our data is significantly different from the normal distribution, and therefore we need to be slightly concerned about that, it may mean that we can't use those standard parametric tests as a consequence. Well, it does mean we can't use those standard parametric tests as a consequence. Okay, so how do we do that calculation? Because all we did in the previous examples was to just kind of go over the high level kind of theoretical reasons for why we would kind of run this test. Ultimately, here we are able to do this test by using Shapiro function. So let's just have a quick look at that. So if we go to the help menu, there we go. So if we bring up the Shapiro-Wilk normality test, which is what we're able to use in this instance, we are able to actually test temperature. And obviously we're looking for the p-value here. So the p-value of 0.09 isn't below that 0.05 significance level that we're interested in, and therefore we would say that we would say there's not enough information to reject the null hypothesis, and therefore the data are normally distributed, and we can actually just check that manually. So that's the nice thing about always visualizing the data. And you know, I think I've spoken about it now in the lecture, and I'm kind of emphasizing it again now, which is you always want to, as a good starting point, visualize the data distribution, start to understand the correlations. Even if you're going to go to more advanced testing, like this is always the place that you should start. Okay. So this looks reasonably normally distributed actually when we look at the temperature data. So it's not a surprise that that came out with that result. Now let's run the ozone test. So when we do that, actually we get a really quite significant p-value, so 2.846 to 10 to the minus 8. So that's really small p-value, well below our 0.05 level, which obviously means that it's not normally distributed. Okay, so that means that something else is going on here, causing it to be non-normally distributed. So let's have a look at that data, and we can see straight away that does not resemble the bell-shaped curve, so the normal distribution curve that we would expect for parametric data, essentially to follow that curve. So this is significant. It means that we can't actually meet the assumptions of many of those parametric tests, and therefore we would need to look at the range of non-parametric options available to us. Okay, so that is the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test and testing for normality. We also looked at the chi-squared test, so let's go and have a look at chi-squared. So the point of chi-squared is to be able to compare the observed frequencies that maybe we collected because we went out and did a survey with these types of frequencies that we would just expect to occur at random. So imagine that we want to check if the expected number of people that commute to George Mason University campus via certain methods is similar to what we sampled. So let's say that we asked a group of geography majors if they walk, bus or drive a car to school, and the results are that 10 walk, 10 take the bus and 40 drive. Okay, so the question therefore is, are these results uniform? So what we're going to do, and I'm just going to clear the environment here so we've got that fresh, is we're going to load in that data into a vector called geog, and we're going to make sure we've got those data points available. What we're going to do first is we're going to take the mean of geography. So why are we doing that? Well, what we want to do here within the chi-squared goodness of fit test is to get the chi-squared test statistic. To do that, we need to sum the number of nominal ordinal categories, here this sum of k. Then what we need to do is multiply it by this numerator here, so it's the observed actual frequency count with the mean or the expected frequency count subtracted, and then raised to the power of 2, so squared, and then divided again by the expected frequency count. And we have the observed frequency counts already now. We stated those and we placed them into the geography vector. What we don't have yet is the expected frequency count, so that's what we need to get. So the expected frequency count is basically the sum of all the observed values divided by the number of, by k, the number of categories which we have, and that gives us our mean value, which for this data is 20. Okay, so now we've got the EI, the expected value. Now what we're able to do is to get the chi-squared, so we can essentially subtract the expected from the geography data, raise it to the power of 2 and divide it by the expected value. And when we do that, what we end up with is chi-squared of 30. Okay. Now what that means is we need to plug that chi-squared value into the inbuilt function, which is going to give us an understanding of the probability of obtaining that value. So if we go here, what we get for p chi-squared is the non-central chi-squared distribution function, and what we're able to do is to give it a probability, and it'll spit out the chance of that occurring, so as a p-value. And basically it's giving us a very, very small p-value, so 3.059 to the minus 7. So it's highly, highly significant, which indicates that we should reject the null hypothesis. There's enough evidence at the 95% significance level for us to reject the null hypothesis and accept the alternative hypothesis, which in this case is that these data aren't uniformly distributed. Okay. So we've been through this test before, so the explanation is that if all observed values are close to expected, the differences are small, and we would fail to reject the null hypothesis. But if the observed values are large, the chi-squared will be large, as in our case, and then we have enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. Okay. Okay, good. And then finally, what we're doing today is just to go over the contingency analysis. So we covered this also within the categorical data lecture, so lecture 11. And within the contingency analysis method, what we're doing is we're actually wanting to test the cross frequencies of two different variables. So for a lot of those other categorical tests that we covered, what we were doing was comparing observed frequency distributions against expected frequency distributions, and that's fine, but that's always kind of comparing an observed outcome against a theoretical outcome. But often what we might want to do is compare two empirically collected outcomes, as we want to do here. Okay, so we need to create a contingency table, basically, and we need to carry out this analysis. So what we're going to do is we want to compare the observed frequency counts of the two variables for independence. So our null hypothesis is going to be that the variables are statistically independent, so they're not significantly related in any way. Whereas the alternative hypothesis is that ultimately we do think there's some sort of an effect, which means that these variables are related in some way. And to do that, we need to get this chi statistic. That's what we want to evaluate. And to do that, we need to run through this equation down here. So we need to take the total number of rows, the total number of columns. We need to obtain the observed frequency count for the ith row and the jth column, and the expected frequency count for the ith row and the jth column. And then we also need to take the square of that and divide it by the EIJ value again. The question is, how do we obtain the EIJ? And to do that, we need to take the sum of all observed frequency counts for row I and the sum of all observed frequency counts for column J, and we need to multiply them together, divide that by n, and that gives us our expected number of counts. Okay, so how do we do that in reality? Well, let's go back to our example that we used before. So let's say that we use the transportation example again, where we asked different majors how they got to campus. And what we're interested in doing is seeing if there's a relationship by transport mode and by the major that people take. So in other words, do we see a difference between the majors? So let's assume that we've got chemistry, math, and we've got geography. So chemistry has 30 walking, 20 people taking the bus and 50 driving. And then math has 20 people walking, 20 people taking the bus and 40 people driving. So let's input all of that into our global environment. In fact, let me just clear this out so that we've got clean memory. So we've got geography, and then we've got chemistry and math, and then these are the three vectors that we need. And actually we can just combine them all into a single data frame here. So we've got a subject on each of the columns. So the downright axis here as it runs across. And what we first need to do, if we go back to our equation, is that we need to obtain the total number of rows. And actually this is very easy. We've done this before many times over, so we can use the inbuilt functions. So n row is the number of rows that we need to obtain from the data frame. Okay, so the number of rows, or you can use ncol, which is the same, which just basically gets the number of columns in an array. So you can just give nrow or ncol the data frame that you want, and it will just spit out those values of interest, which, because it's an even dimension data frame, will be 3 in each direction. So let's just place those values now into the global environment up here. So we've got 3 and 3 columns and 3 rows. It's the most simple, one of the most simple examples that we could possibly have for this particular demonstration. Then we do need to get the marginal sums, so we need to sum across all of the row and column sums. Okay. So we then need to do that. So how do we do that? Well, we use the apply function, which is incredibly versatile actually. So when we look at that, it allows us to apply functions over array margins. So actually you can use apply in so many different ways, because it just allows you to manipulate vectors, arrays, or lists of values. Okay. And applying it to an array or a matrix. So this is a really strong function to understand. Okay, so when we actually place transportation, the data frame, into the apply function and say that we want to run it for 1, which is the dimension, what it's doing is it's summing all the way across the rows. So it's saying for the first row, it's the sums across the row is 60. For the second row, the sums across the row are 50. Blah blah blah. Okay, and then when we do the same for the column, what we end up with is the col sum. So this is just summing all of those columns, so they're summing downwards, basically getting 60, 100, and 80. So hopefully that's fairly straightforward to you now. Let me just print these down to the console so we've got them for later. We also need to make sure that we've got the total n, so that's just telling us what the sum is across all of the different cells within our matrix. It actually is. And then what we want to do is to actually get the expected value. So that's this calculation down here. And what we want to do is we want to calculate this numerator, which is the Ri value. So that's the sum of all observed frequency counts in row I. We need to multiply that against the sum of all observed frequency counts in column J. So rather than us do this manually each time, what we basically need to use is a matrix. So I don't know if you've got background in understanding matrices, but essentially what we're doing here is we're multiplying each one of the row sum values by each one of the column sum values, and vice versa, until we fill out our whole matrix. So what I've done before dividing it by n is just print it out to the console here. So actually, if you look, what we end up with is 60 multiplied by 60 for the first cell. And then we have 60 multiplied by 50 for the second cell down here. And then 60 multiplied by 130, which gives us this cell down here. And then when we do that all the way across, so we move on to the next column, 60 multiplied by 100, we get 6,000, etc. 50 multiplied by 100, we get 5,000, and so on and so forth. You can understand how very swiftly with just one function and the two sets of input data, we're able to multiply all of those individual cells by each other, and that's a key way for us to obtain the matrix of values that we need here to get the expected estimates. And when you divide it by the number of entries that we got, you get these reasonably sensible float decimals down here, which can then be used within our chi-squared test statistic calculation. So what have we done? We've completed the estimation for these two values here. We've completed the estimation for this value here, EIJ. I think we have already got the OIJ and the EIJ. Nope, that's what we're going to get now. So what we've done is we've done the first part, basically. We've got these two parts of the calculation. We've got the EIJ value. Now what we need to do is we need to actually string them together in order to get our chi-squared value. So what we need to do is actually take the sum of all of these values here. So we need to subtract the expected from the transportation data set. So you remember what that looks like, and we've already got the expected values here, and then we can square them and divide them by expected again. So this gives us our chi-squared value, which is 6.17. Okay, so that's still quite a large chi-squared value. And what we then want to do basically is to create the data frame, which we've done over here. And let's have a look at that. Oh, sorry, not data frame. That's the number of degrees of freedom. So we need that in order to indicate to the chi-squared probability function how many degrees of freedom we want to input. But the key point is we've got the chi-squared test statistic, which we've calculated using a formula, and then we placed it into this function in order for us to get the p-value, which here isn't actually significant. Okay, so it doesn't go below that significant level which we're looking for, which is below 0.05. So essentially, in this case, we would accept the null hypothesis that there's no relationship between geography major and the transportation method used to get to GMU's campus. Sorry, the subject major and GMU's campus. Okay, so I think that's fairly clear to you now. You obviously are able to just use the inbuilt function if you want to. So here I've used the chi-squared test, which you're able to have a look at. So we've got the Pearson's chi-squared test for count data, which is just the inbuilt function for what we calculated rather laboriously by hand. Okay, so we ran through this particular calculation down here, and it's producing pretty much the same value that we produced down here. There's always some kind of slight discrepancies because it depends exactly how, for example, numbers might be rounded by the function inbuilt within the R code, or whether we're doing any changes like that. But generally, this is producing the same result. Okay, so I'm going to draw it to a close for today. I think you've got everything that you need now for the assignment that's going to be set this week. So we've covered correlation, which we covered in the lecture this week. We covered normality testing again, which we covered in the lecture 2 weeks ago, the categorical difference lecture, along with the chi-squared analysis and contingency analysis. So that should give you all of the tools that you need in order to submit that assignment. So do reach out to me if any of this doesn't make sense, if you've got questions that you want to ask me. I think that the assignment this week is fairly straightforward. So you've got a set of data, and you just need to work out which statistical tests to use. And I think actually if you just follow the kind of structure that we've used in this lab today, and you understand these tests reasonably well, then you'll be able to work out exactly which ones should be used in those specific contexts within the assignment. So I don't think it should be too taxing for you. Okay, so thanks for tuning in today. It's been nice to see you, and please get in contact if there are any issues. But I look forward then to seeing you next week for the final lecture, which will be on regression, and the final assignment before the final exam. Oh, and one last thing, I just want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. I know with COVID raging right now, it's not a great time to kind of do the whole big celebration thing, but I do hope you manage to get some quality time with your family and stay safe while you do that. Okay, thank you very much, and goodbye, ladies and gentlemen.